When I first played Evil Within, I thought it was going to be an old school top-down GTA game. Then I realised that was just the opening cutscene. Evil Within was described as Shinji Mikami's return to survival horror, as if he was going to revive the genre. This turned out to be wrong for two reasons. Number one is that Alien Isolation got there exactly a week beforehand, with a truly refreshing survival horror game. And number two is that Evil Within isn't a survival horror game. Either that or it's a game suffering with an identity crisis. One reviewer on IGN started their review by quoting how many times they died while playing it. They then went on to say that that's what they believe is the true definition of what a survival horror game is. I found this a little strange because precisely 1 week beforehand, a different reviewer on IGN rated Alien Isolation poorly for precisely the same reason. Those are some pretty high standards, IGN. Some might say those standards are so high they're double. Not to mention the fact that dying a lot in a game doesn't make it a survival horror. Using that logic then, Dark Souls 2 is a survival horror game. Needless to say, it's not. In fact, Call of Duty on Veteran must be a survival horror game too. Some of the best survival horror games don't even involve dying much. I've been recently replaying the HD Silent Hill remake, and I have died very little while playing it. The enemies and the bosses are pretty easy to dodge. You don't even have to fire a gun much, and that's what the essence of survival horror should be. Never mind having to avoid the enemies, just wanting to avoid the enemies is reason enough to be a survival horror. Which brings me on to one of the biggest fundamental problems with Evil Within. In my Resident Evil videos I outlined some golden rules of survival horror, and one of them was scarce resources. In Evil Within, resources are somewhat hard to find, yet you need ammo to kill the hordes of enemies. It is true that there is an impression that this rule is in place. In fact, I'd argue that sometimes all you need is an impression that something's in place in a game. After all, this is a subjective experience, meaning that playing a video game is different for each person who plays it. So I did get an illusion that I was low on ammo, but sadly the more you play the more you realise this is only an illusion. If you didn't have ammo you couldn't kill the enemies, so the game always provides you enough ammo just to get you by. There are countless times where you have to kill all the enemies in an area before you can progress. You're even told so this by your partner.
We'll have to take them all out before we can get in.
I talked a little about this in my Resident Evil 4 video, and what it basically comes down to is, this is where the hunted becomes the hunter. You assume the role of the person who is more powerful eventually. If you're able to kill a room full of 10 or 15 enemies, you must be more powerful than those 10 or 15 enemies you killed. This goes against everything a survival horror stands for. You should be playing as a vulnerable character, and you should feel the need to avoid enemies. I'm going to draw a comparison here to Alien Isolation, and I only use it because it was released around the same time as Evil Within. In Alien you have to constantly hide from the enemies, whether that's the aliens themselves or the androids you face. You feel completely vulnerable during that game, during the entire experience of playing that game. At no time do you feel strong enough to take on the aliens, and this makes you want to avoid them. Whereas Evil Within forces you to fight swarms of enemies, which is an attribute of the action genre. So the main feature in Alien Isolation is to hide from the enemies or sneak past them. Hiding is another feature of many survival horror games. I can honestly say in the entire time I played Evil Within I hid once, and that was at a time where it was totally scripted at the start of the game, almost like a tutorial. There are many instances throughout the game where you can hide under beds or in lockers or, well, that's pretty much it. But you can only do this in very obscure rooms, and as mentioned before, hiding doesn't do anything. In Evil Within you have to kill the enemies, so hiding from them doesn't really help you much. This feels like it was something that was built into the game after it was complete, and does nothing for its reputation as a survival horror game. when you compare it to games like Hunting Ground and Alien Isolation, where hiding is actually an evasion tactic from enemies. Another letdown for me was the psychological horror part of the game, especially when you compare it to the likes of Eternal Darkness. The problem is that the psychological scenes are scripted. Scripted means controlled. When you feel controlled, you lose all sense of horror. This also kills the replay value, because you know what's coming up next. One of the great things about Eternal Darkness was the lower your health got, the more random psychological stuff would happen on screen. This randomness meant that playing Eternal Darkness for the second time, different things would occur. You feel completely out of control playing Eternal Darkness. You never quite knew what was going to happen next. This is the most simplest form of fear of the unknown, and it's something that Evil Within has completely lost out on. Not only do you not feel scared once you've learnt the script, but even first time playing the game, once you realise what's happening is scripted, there's a certain security there, and security is the last thing a survival horror game should have. Another synonymous quality to survival horror games is maze-like environments. I've never called it a golden rule, but let's say it's a silver rule, because a lot of games do have it, though it's not completely necessary. What you miss out on with not having maze-like environments is the possibility of outrunning enemies. When you're faced with a linear path, you quite often have to fight the enemies down that path. And this is my final problem with Evil Within. It's much too linear. There are rare glimpses of what the game could have been like had it not been linear. An example of this is a village quite close to the start of the game, which is incredibly reminiscent of the village in Resident Evil 4. The only difference being that the enemies in the Resident Evil 4 village eventually would return to the church. You didn't have to kill them all. Even the chainsaw guy that chased you didn't have to kill. Whereas in Evil Within you do have to kill the majority of the enemies and the chainsaw guy. If you don't kill the chainsaw guy in Evil Within, you don't progress. So who cares, you might well ask. Who cares if it's linear or it's a maze-like environment? The problem is there's no sense of familiarising yourself with the area. This is something that Capcom really capitalised on in the early Resident Evil games, and indeed in the Resident Evil 1 remake. Once you feel familiar with the area you're in, that's the perfect time for a scare attack. The early Resident Evil games were good at letting you drop your guard and then suddenly spring a zombie on you when you're least expecting it. A good example of this is when the Crimson Head zombies in Resident Evil 1 came back to life. You were forced to walk a path back and forward between them, so you were nearly certainly going to be caught out by one of them. I quite liked the fact that you had to burn the enemies in Evil Within, but then I realised that this was an instant solution. It's not like in Resident Evil where if you leave a body they come back to life. In Evil Within you have the option to burn them, but it's just the same as having the option to kill them. Once they're dead they don't come back to life. The only reason you would burn a body after that is to set flame to another enemy on top of him. And because of the linear gameplay, it wouldn't matter if you did come back to life, you just keep moving forward anyway, so you wouldn't see that. My final thought on Evil Within is that this is Shinji Mikami's return to survival horror. The only problem is that Shinji Mikami believes that Resident Evil 4 was a survival horror game. Whereas if you watch my Resident Evil 4 video, I hope I could convince you that it's not. If you want to play a game that's a lot like Resident Evil 4, then by all means buy Evil Within. But if you want a true survival horror experience, I would recommend you get Alien Isolation, which I hope to review soon.